I have to start by saying that what was published in the newsletter about my speech is not correct. Interesting as though my childhood was, I thought today you might have liked to have something that was a bit more exciting. So we're off to live on the frontier, building the Great Western Railway. And the frontier of New South Wales was established when George Evans and his party stepped off the foot of the Blue Mountains onto the Western Plain. And this moment has been immortalised for us by Banjo Patterson. And this is the way Banjo Patterson wrote about it. Upon the western slope they stood and saw a wide expanse of plain as far as eye could stretch or see go rolling westward endlessly. The native grasses, tall as grain, bowed, waved and rippled in the breeze. From boughs of blossom-laden trees the parrots answered back again. They saw the land, that it was good, a land of fatness and untrod, and gave their silent thanks to God. And that was the start of our frontier. Now, the lady whose portrait is on the easel here was my grandmother, and she was born on the frontier, and she lived on the frontier for many years while they built the Great Western Railway. Now, we've heard what Patterson had to say. My grandmother used to be able to sum up our family history in one sentence. She used to say, they came to Australia to build the Great Western Railway. There is the zigzag railway.
Yes, let's go.
The zigzag railway,
Yeah.
she used to say.
Yeah.
The zigzag railway, and there it is in the picture up there. And I took that picture from a painting by a man named Phil Bilbin, and I used a painting because the photographs don't show the whole of the zigzag. And also, Phil Bilbin painted it with snow all over it, which was often the case.
Yeah.
And my grandmother used to tell me all about these things because she lived with us at Point Clare for the first 17 years of my life, after which she died. And she's buried in Point Clare Cemetery, just down from here, along with her two daughters and her sister and her husband and other members of our family whose name was Donovan. Now, they came to Australia to build the zigzag railway. My grandmother's name was Emily Hollis, and her married name was Emily Berlin. She married a man who was Swedish. But Berlin is not actually a Swedish name, it's a Polish name. It was taken to Sweden many years ago, and it used to have ski on the end. It was Berlinski, and they dropped the ski off the end. So her name at Point Clare was Emily Berlin. And she was a very old grandmother, and when she used to say they came to Australia to build the zigzag railway, her face would all crease up in a great big smile, as though something very clever had happened. And I didn't understand that as a child, but now that I've studied the subject, I do. Because the railways that we enjoy came from England. England was the home of the railways and was the home of the Industrial Revolution. And the railways were an outcome of the Industrial Revolution. And they came about because someone invented the steam locomotive. Now, in England, the railways were started in the 1820s, and my family was involved in building the early railways in England. On my both sides, my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother, their families were both involved in railway development. And the railways in England were built very quickly, and they were taken all over the country. It was a huge railway system, and the result of that was there was a huge burst of prosperity in England as a result of the development of the railways. And of course, even in those days, news used to get to Australia, and when people in Australia heard about it, they wanted the same here. And we did get prosperity when the railways were built. So my great-grandfather, John Hollis, and his wife, whose name was Catherine Fern, her maiden name, they lived in a little village called Willington in Derbyshire. Now Wellington is quite an interesting little place. Its population is still only about 2,300 people, but it's right near the border of Staffordshire and near a river system which is the Trent River and the Dove River. And I really believe that the Hollis family were always involved in transport in some way. I think that before they got into the railways, they were involved in canal building. I have no way to prove that, but I feel that they were, because knowing the people, the kind of people they were. So the others, the Goddens, they were down in Kent. Most of them were cherry orchardists. So how on earth did my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather meet? Well, of course, the answer was the railways, because they took the railways right down through the middle of England in a more or less a straight line down to Kent from Derbyshire. And Harry met Sally, as they say in the classics. Now, people in Australia were wanting the railways, and my family decided that they were going to come. When they left England, my great-grandfather already had 15 years' experience building the railways in England, and his brother Tom came with him, and he had a similar experience. John and Tom were plate layers, and those are the men who put down the big heavy rails. And when they came to put down the rails on the zigzag railway, it was quite difficult. Getting them up into position was a big problem. Anyway, they decided they would come to Australia, and the two other brothers in the family decided they'd go to Canada and build the railways in Canada. And that's what they did. And one of my cousins has actually traced the descendants in America, because they moved from Canada down to New York eventually. Now, this trip to Australia, in those days, people had to plan very well. And my family planned it very well. John and Emily, my great-grandparents, and Tom and Sarah, Tom was John's brother, they decided that it would be a joint enterprise to come to Australia. So they planned it, and they had a big meeting, and they all went up to Wellington, some of them came from Kent, and they discussed what they would do and how they would do it, because there was a baby coming along, and the baby was only going to be 1 year old when they left England. Now, it was very fraught to bring a baby on a sailing ship, because the baby needed to be weaned and able to eat solid food. Many of the babies that came on the sailing ships died because the mothers were breastfeeding them and the milk dried up through seasickness. And this little baby, whose name was Martha, she almost died on the voyage out to Australia, but she survived. But my grandmother said she was always delicate, and she died young. She was 73. But she was much younger than the other people in the family who died. Most of my family have lived into their late 80s and 90s. And one of my cousins who passed away a couple of years ago was 103. So there's something there in the genes. Now, apart from having the baby to bring, they also brought their furniture, and people did that in those days because there was very little in the way of furniture that you could buy in Australia. So they brought furniture, and they arranged it so that brother Tom came first. He came in 1857, and he got here in about October, and Tom had the job of finding somewhere for them to live and also arranging the work. Now, unfortunately, at the time people wanted railways in Australia, it was also the time of the gold rush, and there was a terrible shortage of accommodation. So that was one of the problems that they had. And they were supposed to go and live at Liverpool, which was where the Great Western Railway was to start from, but there was nowhere there for them to live, so they had to live at Parramatta. And the first line planned was going to be from Liverpool to Granville, which is near Parramatta. So that worked out all right, and they lived at Parramatta for quite a while. Now, one of the other things that my great-grandmother made sure that they brought with them was a library of books, because she knew that where they were going to live there were no schools, and she didn't want her children to grow up unable to read and write. And in those times, education was a very big problem for parents in New South Wales, because there were very few ways to get your children taught. I have to say, my great-grandmother did a wonderful job. All her children were taught to read and write by her at home, and they all had very good positions in life and were very good at reading and writing. I have some of the letters that they wrote, so I'm not talking about something I don't know about. And there was one other problem. They had John and Emily, my great-grandparents, they had 3 little girls. Now Tom, the one who came a few months before, his wife was Sarah, and she travelled out with John and Emily, and Sarah and Tom had only one child, a little boy named Will. And Will came with my great-grandparents and his mother on the ship called Joshua, a very strong ship, sound, weighing, with a displacement of 804 tonnes. And of course it was before the building of the Suez Canal, so they came around the west coast of Africa, and they called in at Cape Town to get supplies, as all the sailing ships used to do in those days. So the eldest child of my great-grandparents was Anne, and Anne was very smart. As a matter of fact, when she grew up, Anne became employed by Mrs. Elizabeth MacArthur Onslow at Camden Park as a governess. She was a very smart girl, and some of her descendants had very interesting lives, including one of them who is currently with the Australian Opera, because that family was quite musical. Now Anne did not want to go to Australia. She fought against it, and I've got a photograph that they had taken of her when they were getting ready to come, and her hair's all mussed up and untidy, and you can see in the rebellious look on her little face, she did not want to come to Australia, but she had to come, and she had to do as she was told. But that wanting to go back to England never left Anne, and when she was 13, it got to be too much for her, and she wrote home to her aunt in the cherry orchard in England, in Kent, and said to her Aunt Martha, I want to come back to England. And Aunt Martha wrote back to her and said, well, you must persuade your dear parents to come back to England, and a lot more things that Aunt Martha wrote in that letter, which I have. My grandmother kept all those things. You can see a picture of her writing box where she had them. That picture with a lot of red in it is a picture of the things that she kept. And when she passed away, my mother had that box, and I loved my grandmother so much I couldn't bear to look at that box or touch it, and it took years. It was after the year 2000 that I first touched and opened that box to see what was inside it. But I did, and that was where the family history was. All of it. Now, so we've got them to Australia, and they couldn't live at Liverpool. They had to go and live at Parramatta. But pretty soon there was another baby coming, a little boy, they named him Joseph. But unfortunately, that little boy who was born at Parramatta died when he was only 4 weeks old. They called him after his paternal grandfather. Now, there was then another little boy later on in 1864 at Parramatta, and his name was Edwin, and Edwin survived quite well. But unfortunately, Edwin died when he was only 36 years old. He died of an infection called peritonitis, which would be caused by a burst appendix, I suppose. Anyway, they came to build the Zigzag Railway, and the man who was going to be in charge of all the railways was a man named John Whitten, and you've probably all seen John Whitten because there's a big bronze bust of him on the concourse at Central Station. Now, John Whitten, I can understand now why my grandmother used to grin when she said they came to Australia to build the Zigzag Railway, because while nowadays people think of that as somewhere to go for a little bit of recreation, actually actually, it's regarded now as one of the 20 greatest engineering feats ever.
Wow.
And the man who planned it and got it built, John Whitten, is regarded as one of the 20 greatest engineers of all time. So it's quite an interesting thing because, excuse me, Whitten had a lot of trouble getting that work done. In 1848, there had been a meeting in Sydney of notable people, agriculturalists and other notable people, and a resolution was made that railways would be built in New South Wales. There was going to be a western line, a southern line and a northern line. And that was agreed to, and it was a private company, but it was later on taken over by the government. Now, why was the zigzag railway so important? Well, you can see what they had to do to build it, and it was, they already had a road over the Blue Mountains which had been done by an engineer named Cox. But when I was at school, we had a teacher named Mr. Dennison, who was a countryman, and he explained to us what it was like bringing big wagons of bales of wool over Cox's Road up the Blue Mountains, because the gradient was 1 in 80. And he described to us, I just remember it like it was yesterday, how the driver would sit up the front with the whip and an offsider beside him, and alongside the wagon with its big wheels, near every wheel would have to be a man walking, and each man would have a chock in his hand, and the driver would give the command for the horses to pull, great big draft horses, and then they would pull, and the men would have to run and put the chocks under the wheel so the wagon couldn't slide back. And that process had to be repeated again and again and again. So people thought that a railway over the Blue Mountains would be a very good idea. The only trouble was, the governor at that time was a man by the name of William Dennison, Sir William Dennison. And Sir William Dennison was a soldier, and he was very smart on engineering, and he thought he knew all about this, and he said, no, you can't build a railway over that cliff. And Whitten said, yes you can, and I can do it. Anyway, Dennison thought horse trams would be the way to go. Can you imagine? Wooden rails with horse trams on them traversing the Blue Mountains. But there was a big argument, and Whitten went toe to toe with Dennison, metaphorically speaking, and he got his own way. He wrote this big report, and it was agreed that he could build his zigzag railway. Now, Whitten arrived in December 1856, and he was sworn into his work in the beginning of 1857, and that was the beginning of it all. That was the end of this idea of horse trams. Now, the family, my great-grandfather and his brother Tom, were plate layers, I said, and they were going to have to put down the rails. And they were very experienced, which is unlike a lot of the men that they brought out from England to work on the building of railways, because they had a terrible trouble getting people, because everybody wanted to go and look for gold. But they brought out a shipload of labourers, 600 of them in one ship. So that got them going. And my family, John, Emily, Sarah, Tom, they had to be over at Liverpool, because that's where the action was. Now at Liverpool there was a man who owned a huge property called Collingwood, and that would make a wonderful excursion for the Historical Society sometime, if ever you could get someone to take you there and show it to you. I don't know who you'd get. I couldn't do it, but I don't know anyone who could. But it's a very interesting place, and it was a big grant of land given by Macquarie to the first whaling captain of Australia, a man by the name of Eva Bunker. It ended up in the hands of a man named John Atkinson when they were building the railways, and Atkinson had a very thriving enterprise there with all kinds of things going on. He was developing it as a mill town like they had in England. So Atkinson had the ear of the government. He was a very wealthy man, and he was one of the people who were supporting the building of the railway. And Atkinson wanted a spur built into his property, because they started the railway just near Collingwood, which is near where Liverpool railway station is. And so, because he was a man of influence, no doubt, they said, well, you can have the spur as long as you pay for it. And he said, righto. And then they gave him my great-grandfather and his brother to build the spur. Now that meant that they were entitled to live on the property, because Atkinson, because of the house shortage, Atkinson had built a complex of cottages on his property out of stone. So my families were given each one of those cottages to live in. And that's where my grandmother was born, on the frontier. Excuse me. So while they were living at Liverpool, this little baby that was born had died. I found from looking in the shipping records by a process that's called serendipity that my great-grandmother's younger sister came out to Australia for a visit. She was 20 years old on the sailing ship on her own, and she came out to visit her older sister at Parramatta. Do you mind? She must have been a very adventurous young woman, and I have to tell you that family, whose name is Warden, are full of adventurers, and if you trace them back, they were going trading to Russia in the 1600s, so they had a bit of steel in them. Now Martha came out from England and she stayed with them. I don't know how long she stayed, but I found out that she died when she was only 27 years old, back in England. And I found out because one of my cousins that I got to know over there sent me a photograph of the graveyard, and there was the grave of Martha Warden, aged 27. So it's interesting how people lived in those days. We think, oh, they couldn't do that. They came to Australia, they could never see one another again, but they did. And so the railway started, and very soon they built the spur, and then very soon Whitton had the railway as far as Penrith. In 1866, the railway had reached Penrith, and he was all set to go on and take it over the Blue Mountains. And the first part that was difficult was called the Little Zigzag, which you have seen, because there's a big, what do they call it? All that brickwork for them is there at Lapston on the right-hand side of the highway as you're going towards Bathurst. Now, eventually, after not very long really, that was found quite a difficulty, that little zigzag, and they dismantled it and blasted a tunnel to take its place. Now the railways became a source of great interest to artists and photographers, and probably the painting that's regarded as the greatest painting of the zigzag rail of the Blue Mountains Railway is a painting by Sir Arthur Streeton of the explosion that blasted that tunnel at Lapston. And there it is with a man who's fallen back on his back with the force of the explosion on the ground, and the wife and children of one of the railway workers up on the top above the tunnel, looking in amazement at what had happened, because it was a huge thing to do that. Now, the zigzag railway, well, they had a cliff and a lot of big rocky outcrops, and that all had to be straightened out. It wasn't all nice and levelly graded like you see in the picture. It was a sheer cliff, and those ways where you can see the trains working, there were 3 trains working simultaneously on the zigzag. That was in 1906 when it was in its heyday. They had to carve out of the cliff roads, and they call them roads. They had to carve out these roads to lay the rails on, and getting the rails into position was a huge undertaking, and I really haven't been able to find out exactly how they did that. And to build all those viaducts that they built particularly on what they call the middle road, which is the one you can see in the middle of the picture. To build that, they actually had to pull the blocks of stone up from below, and the men had to be tied onto them with ropes to get them up. And the people, the stonemasons, were Italian, and all those viaducts are in metric measurements because the Italian stonemasons brought their metric tools with them. So that's an interesting little fact that I discovered about the zigzag railway. Now, there were two massive explosions that were necessary to get the rock out of the way, and one of them was 40,000 tonnes of rock, and the other one was 45,000 tonnes of rock. And when they came to build, when Whitten was supervising all that, he had a stone seat carved on Middle Road down this end, near where the viaduct, where you can see the viaduct, and he used to sit there and he used to relay his instructions before the days of telephones and mobile, much less mobile phones. He used runners, either on horseback or on foot. He used semaphores and he used mirrors to send the messages. And later on they had a telegraph, and you can see the telegraph pole there in the picture. The telegraph was a wonderful invention of aid to the operation of the railways, because when they first built the railways they were single tracks, and there were quite a number of very bad accidents when people got on the track and another had a head-on with a train that was coming towards them. So the zigzag railway was needed to get the produce to market efficiently. They couldn't bring it on by road, it just wasn't working, and the people who had settled the Western Plains were complaining about it all, and they wanted the railway. So then it was built, and it took 2.5 years to build it, and it was only 8 miles in extent, and it took 3 hours to traverse it. So there it was. 1869 it was finished, and the terminal station was designed by John Whitten, and there's a picture of it up there. There are daffodils in the garden, and I can't avoid saying that's what a railway station should look like. I think I want to cry when I think about Gosford and the beautiful little park that was the landscape of the Gosford railway station, and how that has been mutilated and destroyed. When the railways were built to the west, the railway stations were a source of great pride, and the gardens were a very important integral part of the railway station. Now, Rydal has the station master's residence as part of the station. So the station master used to go in through that Gothic shaped door that you can see. That was his home. And I know the lady who has the lease on that now, and her name is Anne Crone. And Anne is a lovely person, and she is the heart and soul of the Daffodil Festival. I have there every September a Daffodil Festival, and they have thousands of daffodils, thousands upon thousands of daffodils growing there, and it's really worth a visit. So I have been there every year for the last 3 years. I wanted to see, because my grandmother talked constantly about living at Rydal. They lived there for a long time. Once the railway got to Rydal, which it was a farming community with a big wool growing area, but once the railway got there, the plan was for the railway to be taken on to Bathurst. But everybody got very excited about the fact that you could now get all the apples and the wool and everything to Rydal and get it on the train and send it to Sydney, and they think they forgot about Bathurst, and the people out in the western part of Bathurst and in between were very cranky about that, because the road was very bad. It was a road that had been surveyed and put in by Mitchell, who designed Melbourne. But Mitchell's road got to be in a very bad state, and they had problems with water and mud, and so it took a lot of yelling and screaming and complaining before the railway was taken on to Bathurst. But eventually it was taken on to Bathurst. So my family, the station, I put some giveaway cards with a picture of the Bathurst Railway Station because it was the destination town of the Great Western Railway, and at the same time they were building a line to the south to Goulburn, and Goulburn was the destination station for that line, and you may have seen Goulburn Railway Station, which is also magnificent like Bathurst. Now, my great-grandparents and Tom and Sarah died somewhere along the way. I've never been able to find the record of her death, but she evidently passed away when she was fairly young, and they only ever had the one child. So my great-grandparents, I'm not sure where they lived when they first got to Bathurst. That was in 1876 that railway station was built. But they probably had a house given to them by the railway people, because I remember my grandmother always used to say how lucky they were. They always had a house to live in, because most of the people had to live in tents. And there were, when they were building the zigzag railway, there were 600 men camped in tents at the top of the cliff. And the only permanent buildings there were the gunpowder, the explosive store and the bakery, because they had to have bread. And that was all that was there. It was a terribly hard thing that they had to do. When they had to put the survey in for the lines, the surveyors had to be lowered down in baskets on ropes, and then they marked where the augers had to drill the holes out to put the explosives in, and it went on for a very long time, and 2 of the men were killed doing that work. I'm not surprised. The men who had to get that rock out and make the ways the trains were to travel on, those men had to be lowered down in baskets with picks and shovels to do the work. It must have been incredible, but that's the way it had to be. It was the only way that they could do it. And I was hoping I could get a photograph of that, because there are photographs of the men in the baskets over the cliff, but I haven't been able to locate one, unfortunately. And I have to say thanks to Jeff Potter at Gosford Library for the help that he gave me in finding material for this talk. So they're at Bathurst, and it would have seemed like heaven after the way they had to manage beforehand. And they had a house, and 1876 was a very big year, because that year was the first marriage in the family. The eldest girl, Anne, who never wanted to come to Australia, married a man named Henry Alderton. Now the Alderton family are local people, the Huoi, and the original ones were oyster farmers. But it's like the Commonwealth Bank, I said, there are branches everywhere. and there is a branch of the Alderton family at Bathurst. So Anne married Henry Alderton, and they lived at North Sydney. And that caused another change in the location later on, because eventually they had children, and my great-grandmother wanted to be with her grandchildren in Sydney. So the thing that happened was they had to take everything for the wedding on the train over the zigzag, and the wedding was in Sydney. And I have photographs of them all wearing their wedding clothes, beautiful photographs. And Anne, the bride, was wearing a crinoline, which crinolines had gone out of fashion in England by then, but she was wearing a crinoline. Can you imagine, on a steam train going over the zigzag railway with a crinoline in your bag, and goodness knows what else they had to take. So that was the wedding. Now, life in Bathurst could be very, very nice. And my grandmother, when they got there, was 15 years old, and she lived at home, and girls of her, so I sound a bit snobbish to say, but from her social group, girls from that social group didn't normally go to work in those days. But she and her sister Eliza, who was 3 years older, decided they would go and get a job in Bathurst, and they went to work for a man named William Kelp, who was a haberdasher. And I have found that shop. It's still there, and I have pictures of it. And it's very satisfying to have that, because I never ever thought I'd be able to do that. But William Kilk he became a very wealthy man with haberdashery, and he had a staff of 50 people selling haberdashery. Can you imagine? Now, you'd be lucky to find one if you went into Spotlight. We had 50 selling haberdashery, and 2 of them were my grandmother and her sister Eliza, and they were both very gifted needlewomen, and they could make and do all sorts of things, because my grandmother showed me what they used to do. And they used to get the flour bags, because where they lived for Long White Rydal there was no way to get clothing, and they used to get the flour bags and unpick them and wash them and get the brand out, and that they were made from very fine, high quality calico, and so the flour bags were used for them to make their underwear. And I had, some years ago, I had a couple of camisoles with all fine crochet edging on them that had been made by my grandmother, but I disposed of those. I wish I still had them. But that was the kind of thing that they did with flour bags. And my grandmother wanted to make sure that I knew all about it. She went and got a flour bag, and she showed me how to wash it and how to get the brand out, and how to cut it into things, and what you could make out of it. And believe me, you didn't waste a quarter of an inch.
No.
It was all, even the little tiniest bits were put aside for stuffing, for pincushions. So it was quite an interesting childhood that I had in a way. And the other thing that was very useful was sugar bags, and you could make all sorts of nice things out of sugar bags. And I can remember seeing children dressed in sugar bags, with children who were from very poor families, and you can't believe that there were children walking around in Gosford dressed with just the corners cut out of sugar bag and their arms through. But that's the way it was. Some people were really poor in those days. We're talking about 1939. So my grandmother, she showed me all the things that you could make. You could make pincushions of several different kinds, and you could make children's clothes, and you could make underwear and camisoles and all sorts of things out of a flour bag, and you could make aprons and pot holders and oven cloths out of a sugar bag, and if you had a bit of fancy material, you could use that for edging to make them a bit more attractive and colourful. Well, what did they do as well as that in Bathurst? Well, there was a lot of activity going on. There were lots of parties and balls and meetings, and I had and one of the places my grandmother and her sister used to go was Genoan Caves, and they used to go in a Cobb and Co coach. There's one hill there, and that's the man at the top, James Rutherford, who started Cobb and Co in New South Wales, and he was a very wonderful citizen of Bathurst. He became the heart and soul of Bathurst. He was so public spirited and did so much for the town. And when he arrived, which was 1862, he picked up this run-down coach company from Victoria. But when he arrived at Bathurst, everything was spick and span. And he drove in a cavalcade of horses with teams, each pulling a coach, and him in the lead driver, and the horses were all perfectly matched as to colour. There were 4 horses with each coach, all perfectly matched, and him in the lead. And that's one of the fable, not exactly a fable, but one of the outstanding stories that the people in Bathurst will tell you, how James Rutherford arrived with his cavalcade of coaches, and he had a beautiful house. You can go and see his house at Kiltho if you want to. He built a beautiful house, and it's now the Catholic Education Office, and naturally it's very, very well looked after. So my grandmother and her sister used to go to Genoan Caves. They used to go to balls. People in those days used to visit one another at home, and that was one of the main things they did, particularly the older ladies. They'd go and spend time in one another's homes. And Bathurst had a lot of problems. Well, it always had problems with water, because the drainage was never done properly, and it was on a river, and getting water was a big problem. And my great-grandparents had a well, as did most of the better off people. Not that my great-grandparents were wealthy, but they did end up with a nice little portfolio of properties. And even they were just across the road from Bishop's Court in Seymour Street, and Bishop's Court had a well, and there were public wells, and things used to get very muddy, and there were too many hotels, and there was a lot of drunkenness, and there was prostitution, and all kinds of social evils. But however, it could be a very nice place to live depending on which group you belong to. And there were a lot of Chinese people there, and they had the market gardens. They had finished with the gold mining by that time, and the ones who hadn't gone back to China stayed to be market gardeners or cooks on stations and things like that. So then I actually had a friend who was a descendant of missionaries, Chinese missionaries who worked with some of those people in Bathurst. And that was a very interesting little story that I ferreted out. The water was not piped to the houses, and it was still a problem right up to 1900. And eventually they built a big water reservoir on what was called Gorman's Hill. And that reservoir now is no longer needed, and it's been turned into a magnificent home. Unless you've got $2 or $3 million to spare, it's up for sale. You can go and buy it. It's really beautiful. You would never know that it was a water reservoir, concrete. Another thing that my grandmother did, and she went with one of the Alderton girls for this, she went to Melbourne twice. Now, that was a huge thing for someone to do, because the railway to Melbourne started at Albury, and there was the connection to take the New South Wales Railway to Albury didn't happen until 1883. So my grandmother was in her 20s, and she went to Melbourne. She went twice. She went once with the Alderton girl, and I'm not sure who she went with the other time, but they had their photographs taken in Melbourne, and my grandmother was a fashion plate, as you probably can tell from the picture that's up here, and they had the most beautiful, she was wearing the most beautiful clothes with beading and that sort of thing that were all in fashion at the time. So that was another thing. They had a post office, they had a telegraph office, and they had an annual show that went on for 2 days, and they had balls, and I have a dance card that my grandmother kept from one of the balls, and I've been to the Oddfellows Hall where they used to have those activities, and you can go and see it too. It's in Keppel Street down near the railway station, and it is a truly beautiful place. If you can get in there, it's being used as some sort of a warehouse at the moment, but it has a balcony where the band used to play, and the man who used to own it, who went blind, restored the ceiling. It has all this wonderful Victorian artwork on the ceiling, restored as it was originally. Well, eventually, as time went on, my great-grandfather bought 3 blocks of land adjoining in Seymour Street in Bathurst, and he built himself a nice little cottage out of the red Bathurst bricks. The bricks of Bathurst are very, very pretty in colour. The clay is not very good quality, but the colour is lovely, and all the early houses were built of brick, and weatherboard houses were not allowed, and the council is so particular about Bathurst. They do look after Bathurst, and I do wish that, well, I better not say it, but so there are some people who could take a trip up there and learn quite a lot about how to run a town. Now, so great-grandfather had this nice house, and the 3 blocks of land were narrow, so he used part of the next block as a driveway, because a lot of the houses in Bathurst didn't have any rear access. But he had rear access, and of course he needed that because he had a coal shed at the back, and a garden, and a workshop, and of course the toilet was at the back too. And on the rest of the land, he built what they called a pair of attached houses, what we'd probably call them semis now, but they weren't exactly the same. They were 2 separate houses that had only one wall to join them, and he used those as rental properties. And he retained those even after they left Bathurst, and they were not sold until after he died, which is in 1901. I have all the records of that, and I've met the people who now own what was the family home. I've been in, they took me in there and showed me everything. I've been in the kitchen where my great-grandmother cooked the dinners, and that was a very wonderful and moving experience. So 1890 came, and the younger members of the family had all found their own partners and left home, except my grandmother. And they decided they would go to live in Sydney. So my great-grandfather bought a beautiful, what was then, a beautiful new big terrace house in Newtown. And it's still there, 36 Homewood Avenue. You can go and look at it if you'd like to. Just as beautiful as it ever was. And they lived there. And my grandmother was very good in business. I've got her reference from Kelk's Haberdashery. And she decided she would start her own business in Newtown. So she had a tea shop with dressed poultry. That was how it's always described. A tea shop with dressed poultry. And, well, she was working there, and the shop next door was a shoemaker. And his name was John Berlin. That was my grandfather. So that is how Emily, my grandmother, in the picture, met her husband. He had the shop next door hers. And unfortunately, John Berlin was very successful in business. He had 4 shoe shops making shoes. My grandmother used to help him, and I've got wonderful pictures of my mother when she had her first real little girl's clothes when she was 2 years old, and she's wearing a dear little pair of black kid shoes with roses on, crocheted roses that undoubtedly her mother made for the toes. And the shoes had basil soles because that's what they put little children in, because basil will hold you up. That's what ballet dancers wear on the soles of their shoes. So it was very good for little children learning to walk to have shoes with basil soles. And of course I treasure that set of pictures of my mother. So there they are in Sydney, and Emily marries John, and they go to live in another new house out at Croydon. And the house is still there, 41 Edwin Street. Well, I hope it's still there. Was the last time I looked. And Emily and John had 2 children, Dorothy, who was born when my grandmother was already 39 years old, Dorothy, and the other one was Esme, born 4 years later, and Dorothy was my mother. So Esme, my aunt, she married a man named Jack Vivian Clark, and they lived up in the Wyomingshire eventually when they retired. But just to finish, I have a letter here. It's quite interesting, because this is a letter, one of the letters my grandmother kept, about a meeting. And of course it wasn't like email where you say hi, it was dear madam, I have been instructed to inform you that the Bathurst Bachelors 2C having dissolved, there will be no more assemblies under their auspices. I have also much pleasure in stating that a new committee entitled the Bathurst Hercules 2A out of the members of the late BB2C, and beg that you will consider this an invitation to their assemblies, beginning Thursday next at Oddfellows Hall, the 19th instant, 7:30 p.m. Miss Hollis, I have the honour to be yours faithfully, Frank D. Clark. Now, I was very interested when I found that, because guess what? That man was the father of the man that my mother's sister married. Her name became Clark. And then there's just one other letter about a meeting at Bathurst. Dear Miss Hollis, all being well, our usual quadrith meeting will be held in the School of Arts, Lithgow, next Wednesday evening, the 19th. Now the date on this letter is 1885. Oh. I suppose you have thought I would forget all about the promise I made at Wallerawang. Should you decide to come, kindly let me know by return by which train you come, and I will arrange to meet you either at Bowen Fells or Escbank. Escbank was Lithgow. As a rule, I go down on the train that passes here about 8 o'clock. I don't know what time it leaves Bathurst, but I can arrange to meet any of the other evening trains at Escbank. You would feel tired by the time you got home from the Wallerwang party. I did not get home until Sunday night following. With kind regards, yours very truly, M. Thompson. Now that's the way social life was conducted in those days. And that's my story about the Great Western Railway and what they did.
Great grandparents. 15 years before that.
Thank you.